In addition to being edifying and thought-provoking, today's talk is my public response to University of Virginia Professor Jonathan Haidt's 2008 TED Lecture on the moral roots of liberals and conservatives. Although it's been exactly 4 years since he made this presentation, it has since had over 1 million viewers and was the reason Bill Moyers first took notice of Dr. Haidt and invited him to appear on his new TV show, Moyers and Company, just 3 weeks ago. I first saw him on the website TED.com, Moyers tells his audience. That stands for Technology Entertainment Design. It's the nonprofit that brings together some of our most creative and provocative thinkers. After showing a lengthy clip from the TED Talk, Moyers goes on to say, his ideas are controversial, but they make you think, which in my opinion is a compliment that Dr. Haidt well deserves. Still, I have some profound disagreements with him that I intend to outline today, but I don't mean for anything I say to diminish my respect for the professor, nor my admiration of his courage in publicly espousing his controversial views. So I'll begin by admitting that there is much that Dr. Haidt says that I'm in complete agreement with, and will attempt to summarize his views as accurately and fairly as I can manage. Early into his 2008 lecture, this intriguing social psychologist surmises that liberals are much higher than conservatives on a major personality trait called openness to experience. People who are high on openness to experience just crave novelty, variety, diversity, new ideas, travel. People low on it like things that are familiar, that are safe and dependable. Although I'm in agreement with this, it is not the provocative part of Haidt's theory. We would expect those who are open to experience to seek new experiences, and those who are closed to experiences to stick with the familiar. That's rather obvious. But I do appreciate Dr. Haidt's bravery in openly declaring this distinction, which he largely attributes to the work of researcher Robert McRae, who says, open individuals have an affinity for liberal, progressive, left-wing political views, whereas closed individuals prefer conservative, traditional, right-wing views. At a time of such political division and polarization in our own nation, sometimes the obvious needs to be stated. Someone needs to say the emperor has no clothes. After all, there might be some closed-minded people around who aren't very open to being called closed-minded. He continues drawing this distinction with a special emphasis on the moral differences between liberals and conservatives, suggesting we are all born with a basic moral instinct that is characterized by what he calls the 5 foundations of morality. The first, called care harm, is a nurturing kind of morality built on our mammalian instinct to bond with others and dislike those who cause us harm. He likens the second, called fairness and reciprocity, to the golden rule morality that is the basis of many religions. The third foundation, in-group loyalty, is morality based on cooperation with others, often in order to join in solidarity against others. The fourth foundation, authority, respect, is based on the human ability to defer our will to others, or as I would put it, to give away our freedom, often out of fear or even perhaps love. And the fifth foundation, purity, sanctity, refers to a morality based on the notion that virtue can be obtained by controlling the body and its appetites. Although I'm not sure we're actually born with all these moral instincts, I do agree that these 5 foundations are a good summarization of the moral spectrum. I also agree with Haidt that liberals tend to gravitate toward the care and fairness end of the spectrum, while conservatives are more concerned with group loyalty, respecting authority, and purity. Because liberals reject three of these foundations, he says, they say, no, let's celebrate diversity, not common in group membership. They say, let's question authority, and they say, keep your laws off my body. He admits our motives are noble, given that, in his words, traditional authority, traditional morality can be quite repressive and restrictive to those at the bottom, to women, to people that don't fit in. So liberals speak for the weak and oppressed. The problem with liberal moralities, he continues, is they want change and justice, even at the risk of chaos. I'm not really sure at this point what he means by chaos, though I presume he's referring to the kind of social unrest that leads to civil wars, revolutions, mass protests, terrorism, and even civil disobedience. Conservatives, on the other hand, he goes on to explain, speak for institutions and traditions. They want order, even at the cost of those at the bottom. The great conservative insight is that order is really hard to achieve. It's really precious, and it's really easy to lose. From my moral perspective, as a liberal, I must admit I was stunned at how easily Dr. Haidt so seamlessly and nonchalantly goes from mentioning order at the cost of those at the bottom to praising conservatives for recognizing how precious order is. In fact, this was the point in his lecture that I wondered if Dr. Haidt was setting us up for what I consider a simple dualistic explanation of morality by concluding that liberals and conservatives are just two sides of the same coin, the yin and yang of a circle that is incomplete without both. The word that actually came to my mind is Manichean, referring to that ancient Persian belief in a universe made up of absolute opposites, light and darkness, good and evil. But it has since become a figurative reference to any kind of dualistic or black and white thinking. To my surprise, it was also a word that Dr. Haidt used multiple times during his interview with Bill Moyers. In his argument, Manichean thinking refers to the idea that the world is divided and everyone must take a side, which is fair enough. But I think the larger point is that the world is seen so simplistically to begin with. It reminds me of the time that George W. Bush was asked if he thought creationism should be taught in public schools, and he responded that both sides should be included. Nevertheless, as Haidt rightly suggests, it's okay to have membership and rivalries. All that stuff is okay unless it crosses the threshold into Manichaeism, referring to that tendency to see those who are different from us as utterly evil. That's right, he tells Moyers. Because once you've crossed over from normal political disagreement into Manichean good versus evil, to compromise, I mean, we say, his ethics were compromised, and you don't compromise with evil. On this point, I'm also in agreement with Dr. Haidt. Politics has become so polarized, as President Obama has well learned, that any compromise is nearly impossible. Haidt's solution, however, seems to be for us all to recognize that every moral position is true, that the belief that the order should not be compromised even at the expense of those at the bottom is as moral as the notion that we should all be treated equally. As tempting as I am to embrace this rather lazy, dualistic, Manichean worldview, however, I cannot accept that my liberal morality, based upon compassion and equality, is on par with a morality based on groupthink, blind obedience to authority, and sexual purity. I don't accept that we are comparing apples to apples, or more precisely in this case, one half an apple to its other half. With all due respect to Dr. Haidt, I believe this naive position is the result of his simplistic misunderstanding and misappropriation of Eastern philosophy and religion. As I had predicted by the end of his lecture, his argument becomes entirely dualistic, to the point that he even begins comparing these two moral perspectives to Taoism's most pervasive symbol. Yin and yang aren't enemies, he says. Yin and yang don't hate each other. Yin and yang are both necessary like night and day for the functioning of the world. This perspective may not be Manichean to the extent that Haidt doesn't consider one side right and the other wrong, but I do believe it is to the extent that he views both positions as proportionate halves of a whole. If this is truly the case, then our ideas of morality are of no real consequence. It doesn't matter if you take the liberal or the conservative position, because both are equally good and right. There's no need to argue politics or concern ourselves about the plight of the weak and oppressed, as Haidt describes them, because we actually need people who are willing to impoverish and oppress others to maintain harmony and bring balance to the force. So what's the point? What should you do? He asked, just before suggesting we should combine the greatest insights from ancient Asian philosophies and religions with the latest insights on moral psychology. If we do, we should come to the conclusion that our minds have evolved to naturally divide us into teams, and the only way to break free of its delusions is to, in his words, step outside the moral matrix, just as he has done. He even goes so far as to tell Bill Moyers that he's stepped out of the game. I take this to mean Dr. Haidt considers his a more detached and therefore enlightened viewpoint. For by not choosing sides, having gone from being a liberal to a self-described centrist, he can, like a benevolent bodhisattva, now help enlighten the rest of us. I'm hoping in the coming year, he tells Moyers, I can be the guy saying, come on, people, just hear. Understand the other side so you can stop demonizing. And now you can argue more productively. So good luck with that. In his 2008 lecture, he also likens himself to the character Morpheus from the movie The Matrix. I'm here today to give you a choice. You can either take the blue pill and stick to your comforting delusions, or you can take the red pill, learn some moral psychology, and step outside the moral matrix. Again, out of deep respect for Dr. Haidt, it is not my intention to see mocking or diminish his noble desire to help us all get along better. But in the spirit of genuine dialogue, I must honestly say I believe his interpretation of the facts, I agree with, to be a simplistic, two-dimensional interpretation of a multidimensional subject. This leaves him with little option but to naively and passively skim over grave injustices and falsehoods as if they are of little significance, and to likewise diminish the importance of a nobler, more mature moral understanding. During his TED lecture, upon showing an image of two Hindu gods, Vishnu, the creator, and Shiva, the destroyer, sharing the same body, Haidt explains, you have the markings of Vishnu on the left, so we can think of Vishnu as the conservative god. You have the markings of Shiva on the right. Shiva is the liberal god, and they work together. Perhaps there is some deep metaphysical truth in this image, but I don't think it in any way suggests conservatives are society's creators, and liberals their destroyers, simply because one side craves order at all costs and the other side seeks progress. During his interview with Moyers, for example, Dr. Haidt compares Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper to the principle of karma. The grasshopper fiddles away all summer while the ants are working and working, preparing for winter. The grasshopper considers the ants silly until winter does arrive and he comes knocking on the door for help because he's starving and freezing to death. As some liberals see it, Haidt says, the ants are supposed to feed the grasshopper. But to the conservative, the grasshopper gets exactly what it deserves, no more, no less. At one point he explains karma is the Sanskrit word for work, going on to say, if I am a lazy, good-for-nothing, lying scoundrel, the universe will write that and I will suffer. But then along comes liberal do-gooders and the federal government to bail them out. I could not tell in the interview if this is actually Haidt's position or if he was merely giving voice to the conservative viewpoint. But in either case, the statement presumes that all who suffer deserve to suffer because they are lazy and good for nothing, not because they are among the weak and oppressed. It also seems to pass over the historical reality that it was George W. Bush, a staunch conservative, who handed out the first $700 billion bailout back in 2008. What's really disturbing, though, is that Haidt first referenced this fable in response to a video clip of a Republican debate during which Congressman Ron Paul was asked what should be done in the case of a healthy 30-year-old who chooses not to buy health insurance but ends up in a coma. When asked directly, "Congressman, are you saying society should just let him die?" some in the audience began shouting yes and applauding. Haidt responds, "So what they're applauding for there and what they're saying, yeah, let him die, the reason they're saying that is because they want a world in which karma functions." This guy made a choice. He made a choice to be a free rider. He made a choice not to buy health insurance, and if karma works as it should, no one will pay for it and he will die. Now, if you value the CARE Foundation, that is extremely cold. But if you value fairness as proportionality, that's what has to happen. And this is a good example of the fault I find in Haidt's dualistic thinking. In his two-dimensional perspective, both responses to the grasshopper, or the man in the coma for that matter, are moral, because both are ultimately equal. But developmental psychology tells us that morality isn't a matter of polarity, but grows through various stages, and not just two, over time. In fact, the lower stages of moral development reflect the sort of puritanical, authoritarian groupthink that Haidt's theory places on par with compassion and morality and equality. But as Jean Piaget, the founder of developmental psychology, once explained, if obedience and equality are brought into conflict, meaning that there's a dilemma between the two, the child is always in favor of obedience. Authority takes precedence over injustice. In other words, what Haidt describes as conservative morality is comparable, according to Piaget's research, to the moral thinking of young children. Perhaps it's no surprise then that early in his life, Piaget said things like, without the conservative spirit, the people would not have remained in their misery. They would not have been faced with an obstinate bourgeoisie ignorant of its duties. It is the conservative spirit which is guilty, because without it, woman would be equal to man, and never would the horrors of this century have withstood her. The great criminal is conservatism. Likewise, the highest stages of moral awareness, according to developmental psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, consider certain universally applicable principles, like equality, compassion, and justice, to far outweigh the significance of any particular laws, social conventions, or concerns of the status quo. By recognizing the primacy of justice over all other moral considerations, he wrote, civil disobedience is justified if and only if it is preventing a legally condoned injustice. Although Kohlberg characterized the highest stage of morality as justice, he often defined justice as equality. The basic rule of justice is distributive equality, he said. Treat everyone equally. His protege, Carol Gilligan, a giant in the field herself, called the highest principle, what do you think? Anyone remember? Care. Care, which is precisely the term Haidt uses to characterize liberal morality. She describes it as a type of consciousness, a sensitivity to humanity, that you can affect someone else's life. You can affect your own life, and you have a responsibility not to endanger other people's lives or to hurt other people. She also writes, while an ethic of justice proceeds from the premise of equality, that everyone should be treated the same, an ethic of care rests on the premise of nonviolence, that no one should be hurt. Haidt argues the greatest wonder in the world is cooperative societies, and seems to overly admire conservatives for valuing it so highly and doing whatever it takes, even at the expense of those at the bottom, to preserve it. He also encourages us, as noted, to step out of the moral matrix, so we too can see the moral necessity of ignoring the cold, hungry grasshopper knocking at our door, so that we too can appreciate how precious and fragile order really is, so important that we ought to preserve it even at the expense of those at the bottom, women and those who don't fit in, the weak and the oppressed. Reciting the words of Zen masters and Zon, Haidt says, if you want the truth to stand clear before you, never be for or against. The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. So this, for me, is really the crux of the problem. Haidt asks us to learn a little about moral psychology, instructs us to step outside our own morality, to conclude with him that all morality is really the same because it's part of the whole. Yet if we truly do learn a little more about moral psychology, or perhaps more than a little, we find that the moral foundations Haidt outlines might be part of a holistic process, but they are far from equal. As Erich Fromm once complained, equality today means sameness rather than oneness. This, for me, is the subtle error in Haidt's thinking. The moral spectrum he outlines is part of a process, but it doesn't mean all parts are the same. As the developmentalists tell us, the highest stages of moral awareness reflect care and compassion, equality and justice. What Haidt himself defines as liberal morality. So as one who is open to new experiences, I'm always willing to look at my morality objectively, to question my moral assumptions, and I do so regularly. What I'm not willing to do, however, is compare apples to apples when we're talking about apples and oranges. What I'm not willing to do is step out of the game.